Hello everyone, today I'm going to be talking about my main laptop, which is this Alienware 13R2. It's just a standard dual core i5 using a GTX 960M, which is a 2GB of VRAM video card. It's not the fastest. Here is the Tomb Raider benchmark running at 720p on normal. You might not be able to hear them, but the fans are spinning, not at the highest speed, but it does get a little warm to the touch. But overall, it's decent performance. If you're looking to pick one up today, it's about 450 to 400, depending if you get the i5 or the i7 version. I would recommend the i7 version, because the i5 version does bottleneck the GPU a lot. The GPU should be around about a GTX 750 Ti, but in reality, it is much lower with this i5, so you really are limited to running older games. In fact, even Tomb Raider struggles on this particular laptop. So if you're looking at getting an older gaming laptop for gaming, you can do it. I mean, here you can see it's running on normal and you're getting 60 FPS, so that's absolutely fine. And you can pick this up for 450 to 400, so it's a good laptop for that. Just be aware what you're paying for. You can upgrade the RAM. It can take NVMe SSD, so it's nice and fast in that sense. But for a gaming machine, you are going to be limited to older titles, which should be absolutely fine if that's what you're after. This is a better deal than buying, let's say, a brand new £450 laptop with just Intel graphics, because you might get a faster CPU, yes, but in terms of GPU performance, it's going to be much lower. And I originally purchased this to do some, well, it was basically for a master's degree, so it was used for a few AI projects and stuff, which is what I needed the GPU for. CPU wasn't as important to me then, and I had a budget around about 900 quid. So I bought this for about 950, which at the time, really good price. Anyway, enough about that. Let's just quickly highlight the specs. It is an Alienware 13R2. They don't seem to do the 13-inch anymore at all, which is a massive shame. I love this form factor. Obviously everything backlit because of Alienware. Not a massive fan of their stuff generally, but this was a good spec for the price. i5, as you can probably see here, it's the 6200U. Officially it can take 16 gig of DDR3 low voltage, but you can technically put it up to 32. It's just not officially supported, and it can take 2 NVMe SSDs or 1 SATA SSD, so there's room for improvement there. Dual fans, runs silent pretty much all the time apart from when you're gaming, and even then it doesn't get too bad. It gets a bit warm at the keyboard, which isn't ideal. Now on the back there is the Alienware graphics adapter port. I had one of those a few years ago, and you can basically shove a full-size graphics card in there and boost the performance of this machine, but because of that really slow CPU, you can't get much out of it. So anyway, let's get on to some benchmarks, shall we? So before I get on to gaming benchmarks, here's the PC Mark benchmark running in the background. It performs just fine here. No issues at all with browsing the web, documents, that kind of thing. And that doesn't matter if you're on low power, running on battery, or at full power. It runs just fine. I've used this to write applications and things like that, and while it's not the fastest, it's no issue at all. You can spend all day working on this and there's no issues. Power consumption wise, it pulls about 13 watts to 15 watts at idle, and during this benchmark it's between 25 and 45. You can see it peak around about 60 during gaming, but for office use it's going to be around about 45. So without further ado, let's move on to some actual games and see how it actually performs in reality when actually playing some games. Now I'm going to switch over to the capture machine, so you won't hear any of the fan noise or anything like that, but it can get reasonably loud, and at the end I will do a comparison of the fan noise between its idle, medium fan, which is what it's doing at the moment, and when it's at the highest. So without further ado, let's go look at some games, some older and newer, and you will see the performance difference, and you can see where this kind of lands in what you can actually play. So let's start off with the good old Final Fantasy XIV benchmark. It runs reasonably well. You're getting around about 30 FPS, which is playable. I play it on a GT 1030 and it's more than playable at that kind of frame rate. In comparison to other cards, you can see it sits around about the AMD's APU of the 4300, which, you know, that's pretty respectable, but it's not great, let's be honest. It's a bit slow, but that's where it sits for this game. Sticking with some benchmarks for the minute before looking at some actual games. In 3D Mark, you get an interesting picture that shows where the weakness of the laptop lies. In Time Spy, we're scoring around about the 4300G, which is expected. Same with Fire Strike. But when we get to some slightly lower graphically intense ones like Night Raid, it drops right down, as well as in Wildlife, so it's actually weaker in those. And that's because of the weaker CPU overall, which isn't surprising because it is a low-end i5, only 15 watt, but it just goes to show where this one starts to struggle. Anything too high a frame rate and the CPU does struggle to keep up. Moving on to Tomb Raider, this is the rebooted version. This is running at 1080p on the normal preset. As you can see in this particular cutscene, it's sitting around about the 50 mark. So you're not going to get a solid 60 FPS in this game. It will occasionally hit the 60 mark, but it will struggle. So you might want to turn VSync on to just, you know, keep it a bit smoother, give it some tearing. But it is GPU limited here rather than CPU limited, which isn't a massive shock, but that's what you get. So you can play something like Tomb Raider, but just don't expect amazing frame rates. Though you can get 60 FPS locked if you go onto low. We'll go to 720p.
Damn it.
So sticking with some older games, here's Alien Isolation. As you can see, it's getting around about the 50 FPS mark on average, maybe in the high 40s at times. This is on the Ultra preset, so it's got some room for improvement, but generally the settings don't make a massive amount of difference in this game. It's running slower than the 4300G, for example, and it's running slower than, let's say, a GT 1030. So that's about right, because this card's around about the GT 1030 GTX 750 Ti. So it's in that ballpark. Once again, it's that CPU bottlenecking a few things. But here, the CPU is not a real issue, it's the GPU that's holding it back.
Data set.
Now again, the point needs no introduction, this is Half-Life 2. No shock here, being a rather optimised title overall, and being very old at this point. You're getting easily 100 FPS plus. This isn't at the highest settings, but it's pretty high up there. So you've got plenty of room for improvement on this particular game. And yeah, so something like Half-Life 2 can play just fine on this laptop, which isn't particularly a shock. Moving on to something more modern, but of an odd style, is the best way to put it. Here's Octopath Traveler, running on the low setting. As you can see, and as you get with like the GT 1030 and things like that, this game can't quite run at 60 FPS at 1080p. You're getting around about the average of the high 30s, which for a game like this is actually acceptable. Some people might not think that's the case, but it's perfectly playable, and it's a very enjoyable game if you like games of this style. So stuff like Octopath Traveler can be played on this laptop, just not at the highest settings at 60 FPS.
Scorch the earth.
Sticking with more modern games with a simpler graphical style, here is Sea of Kings. This game runs just fine on something like a GT 1030. Of course, you're not going to get massively high frame rates, and this is running on medium. You get around about the 30 FPS mark most of the time, and that's perfectly acceptable for a game like this because it's not very fast paced and it's quite relaxing, I find, to play, so a lower frame rate is perfectly fine. You might disagree, but if this is what you got, you can play a game like Sea of Kings without much issue. Now let's move on to some games that do struggle a little bit more. Here is Divinity Original Sin 2 running on medium, and as you can see here, you get around about 30 FPS, 35 average, which personally I find that acceptable to play, but being a more graphically intense game, and as it is, people like this to run at 60, so this is getting into the region where you might not be happy with that kind of performance. You can knock it down to low, but it looks pretty terrible at that point. But for a turn-based game, I find this perfectly acceptable, and it's how I originally played the game. So I probably put in about 400 or 500 hours into this game, probably more, using these kind of settings, so it's more than playable at that. But you are free to disagree, of course. Now let's look at the re-release of Mafia. Here's just a scene near the start of the game. I like to use this one because when you get hit by the car, you normally get a dip in the frame rate, which as you can see there was 0. This is absolutely CPU limited and GPU limited across the board, and this is running on low. So something like Mafia is just unplayable on this particular laptop. You might be able to get a little bit better performance at 720p, but as you can see, that CPU is maxed out, so it's very, very unlikely that this will ever be playable on this laptop. So there's an example of a game that will not run. Now let's go look at Fortnite. Now Fortnite's always a bit of an oddball in terms of performance. It requires a lot of CPU grunt for whatever reason. There is the performance API which helps in this situation sometimes, but it causes odd issues, and I try not to share it because that's your choice if you want to run it. But this is the recommended settings which is dialed in, which is medium at a 66% internal resolution. But it did recommend 30 FPS, like the FPS cap. So I knocked that up to unlimited, and this is what you're seeing here. And because the CPU is pretty much always hitting the 100% mark, you're getting dips into the teens and much lower FPS every now and again, which you don't want in a game like this. You want a nice smooth experience even if the frame rate's a little lower. So here it is on the same settings with the 30 FPS cap, and as you can see, you're getting a much smoother experience. The average frame rate is 30-29, which is what you want. Well, it's not what you want, but it will make this a more playable experience overall. You might not like that frame rate, but if you want to play Fortnite on this laptop, you can. Just accept that you're having to run it at 66% internal resolution, and you're having to use a 30 FPS cap. Well, there we have it. It's not the fastest machine in the world. It wasn't when I bought it. But for the price you can pick these up at the moment, which is around about 400, 450, you could go much worse. And it's nice to be able to have a little bit of graphical grunt to be able to play some things. So it is nice to have. It's not too loud, The fans, as you heard just, are not too bad at all. I've heard far, far worse. And overall, it's a very lovely machine. Of course, if you're looking for something brand new, you're probably better off going for something AMD related, because the AMD APU is, they're pretty good. But overall, it's not a bad machine. Speed is comparable with most modern machines, and you can get quite a lot of work done in office in terms of office work. So if you're in the market for a second-hand laptop, certainly have a look at something of like this kind of vintage. Try and get the i5 though, because try and get the i7, because the i5 is not great. But that's just a minor point. Don't look at it for playing games, and if you do, you really are limited to pretty much retro titles at this point, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Once again, it's much better than Intel's onboard offering, even on the newer stuff. So that's all I really want to say on this particular laptop. I use it every day. It's a brilliant little workhorse. You may disagree, but I do like these lower power machines. And for a gaming laptop that only pulls about 65 watts, I mean, you could do much, much worse. And that's pretty phenomenal, even compared to some AMD's offering at the moment. So, looking for a low power gaming machine on the move. They can handle stuff like Final Fantasy XIV. Granted on low settings, 30 FPS, but it works. Certainly pick one up. So until next time, thank you for watching. I'll promise to have more videos coming soon. It's been a bit hectic lately, trying to move house and various other things. Not had much time to set these things up and benchmark hardware. And a lot of the stuff now is in storage. But over the coming weeks there should be some more stuff coming. More retro related probably, because I have a few things that haven't quite gone into boxes yet, and a few more Skylake machines that I have lying around, because I bought a fair few of them when I was going through a period at university where I needed a lot of hardware. So until next time, thank you for watching, and goodbye.